Hi, I'm Christy and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm here with some romantic suspense book recs. Alright, so it's now the very beginning of September, but I read some romantic suspense books that I absolutely loved in August. They were some of my favorite reads of that month, probably of the year as well, and I just had such a fun time with those, so I wanted to just share a bunch more because I realized I have a good amount to share, so I wanted to do this rec video today. So I think I have 15, kept it at 15 to recommend for you today. Alright, so we're going to start off with the ones that were the inspiration for this video. So in August, I read Bourbon and Lies by Victoria Wilder, and I was so obsessed with this book. It was my favorite read of August. I had such a good time with this book. First of all, the cover is one of my favorites. It's so stunning, and I just had to have it based on the cover alone, and then I'm so glad that the book worked so well for me as well. This is my first read by this author, and this is the first book in her Bourbon Boys series, which is going to be a series, and I'm so excited for the rest of the books in the series because you meet some of the side characters in this one. So this is a small town romantic suspense where the heroine is on the run. She's in hiding with witness protection, and she ends up being dropped off at the hero's family's bourbon business. And so it kind of goes from there. I will say this book has some heavier content warnings, so just know that going in. I think the author provides them at the beginning of the book. Yes, she does. So it's definitely more violent and death on page and just kind of like gets kind of dark and gritty, which I really enjoy in my romantic suspense books. So just know that going in. Like I said, the author provides content warnings as well. And I put them in my Goodreads review as well if you do need to see them. But yeah, I had such a good time with this one. Basically, we start off seeing the hero. He was a former cop, and we kind of see his little like backstory in the prologue. And then we cut to, I think, 5 years later, and now the hero is no longer working as a cop, and he has joined the family's bourbon business along with his brothers and grandfather. So it kicks off within the middle of the night. The heroine ends up getting dropped off at the hero's family's kind of business, ranch. It's not really a ranch, but it kind of gives like ranch vibes. It's set in Kentucky. So she gets dropped off by like a U.S. Marshal who puts her kind of in witness protection and drops her off at his family's business. And so she's actually staying with one of his brothers who kind of owns or is the head of the family and the business. So she's in hiding and staying there, and then she ends up meeting the hero like the next day. So we get from the heroine's kind of POV and her backstory that she witnessed something or was part of something that now has her in a lot of trouble, has some people out after her, and so she needs to go into hiding. And so she's hiding at the bourbon kind of business ranch kind of setting. I loved in here how the hero has like very much like alpha kind of grumpy vibes at first, but with her he's like so flirty and he's so taken with her, and he's kind of like disgusted at himself at being taken with her because he thinks she's like his brother's, you know, fling or whatever. And so the heroine as well, I love in here how the heroine is just super sassy and brazen, and she just like stands up to the hero and says whatever she wants to him, which I love that in my heroines. So I just loved their kind of dynamic. So she ends up living right across from him, and we have that close forced proximity, as well as she starts working for his family's bourbon business as well while she's there in hiding. And so the hero the whole time is kind of trying to figure out why she's there, because she doesn't tell him her secrets right away because she was told like not to tell anybody what she witnessed, what she saw, why she's in hiding, any of those things. And so he knows because of like his cop background that something is a little different with her, and he's trying to figure her out while also being pulled to her, while also trying to stay away from her because he knows this is just like temporary. And she's kind of having those same feelings of like, I'm not here permanently. I'm also kind of attracted to this guy, but also I have things that I can't open up and tell him, but maybe I should. Can I trust anybody? So it was just so good. I was obsessed with this book, loved it so much. Highly recommend checking it out. Like I said, the next book from the author comes out at the beginning of next year. It's already on my like 5-star predictions for myself for 2025. I cannot wait. I just had such a good time with this book and loved it so much, so I highly recommend. All right, next up is Broken Beginnings by Cleo Evans. So this author usually writes monster romances, but this is her first kind of like small town romantic suspense book, and I was so obsessed with this one. This one was another of my favorites from August. And so again, this book and Bourbon and Lies is why I wanted to do this rec video. So here is the pretty cover for this one. This one again has some heavier content warnings, so just know that going in, the author does provide them at the beginning of the story as well. And it is in my Goodreads review as well if you need to see any of the like content warnings before getting into any of these books really. So this one, we see the heroine as a teenager, and we see her in her small town in Texas, and she hates living there. Basically, her father left her and her sister when they were younger. Her mother ended up passing away, and her and her sister ended up living with their grandmother and being raised by her. They kind of didn't really have a lot of things growing up, and so life was a little hard for them. And then she also had like this high school bully who was always kind of picking on her and giving her a hard time. Not gonna lie, I was not a fan of some of the things he was doing to her in the prologue, and I was like, oh my god, I hope this guy is not the hero. And then I looked back at like the chapters to see the hero and the heroine's like POVs and saw his name is the hero of the story. So I was like, oh god, like where is this gonna go? But I will say it was done so well, so definitely don't judge him based on like his actions as a high schooler, because the grovel and the apologizing and and all of those things that the hero definitely wants to like make it up for her. He definitely does that in this book, so just know that. All right, so anyways, we see the heroine. She ends up graduating high school and she moves away. She becomes like a travel writer for like a really popular like international travel magazine, and so she's just kind of doing her independent life. She wants nothing to do with her small town, so she ends up witnessing a murder in her apartment building. Is actually there when the person actually like passes away in her arms, and so she's kind of targeted by the murderer, and he's like, you're gonna be next. And so now she has to go into hiding, and so she's like, oh my god, I need to get away. So she ends up going back to her small town in Texas where she hasn't been for like 14 years and like had always sworn she would never return. So she ends up running into the hero again while trying to kind of hide out in her small town, and she doesn't really tell anybody what's going on. She's just kind of in hiding by herself, and so she ends up meeting the hero again, or kind of running into him again, and she ends up starting to work at his winery that he owns on his family's kind of farm and orchard. And so he's just very apologetic about how he was as a teenager and wants to make it up for her. He's constantly trying to make amends, buy her gifts, like apologize to her with his words, all of those things. And so finally she's like, okay, yeah, let's move forward and just see where it goes, because she does, you know, accept his apology for how he was as a teenager. So I did really love that. I loved how much he wanted to grovel and make amends to her. And so it kind of goes from there with that very like small town vibes. We see her working at the winery, and then some things start happening around town that she realizes that obviously the person who is targeting her has found her possibly, and it kind of goes from there. This one is the first in a new series, which is the Citrus Cove series, and I'm just very excited for what's to come next, because we meet some of the side characters and the family members, and I know that some of them are going to get books next. I think the next one is an MMF setup with a single mom, and so I'm very, very excited for that one. And I just had a really good time with this one, so highly recommend checking it out. Next up is Fragile Sanctuary by Catherine Cowles. So honestly, a ton of Catherine Cowles books are going to be ones I'd recommend for romantic suspense, but this is her newest series and the first book in the series, so this is the one that I'm just going to recommend in this video today. This book has so many of my favorite tropes. So it's a brother's best friend, a small town, touch her and die vibes. It has grumpy sunshine, a little bit of age gap. There's forced proximity and found family, and just like all the good things that I love and eat up is in this book. So like a lot of Catherine Cowles books, her prologues will always just hurt so bad, because you see the setup of her heroines usually, or sometimes her heroes, but basically the kind of backstory of the characters. And this one in particular, we see the backstory of the heroine and how she lost her family when she was younger, and all of the tragedy that kind of created her character. And so we cut to years later, and we see that she is the owner of like her old Victorian home that she kind of grew up in, and so now she is ready to renovate it. And so she ends up kind of moving into it while she's doing her renovations, because it's been enough years and she feels like now is the time for her to do that. And so when she's there, she actually ends up running into the hero, who is her brother's best friend, and he owns the construction company with her brother, who's going to help her do the renovations. So I love how they meet at the house, and she's kind of just doing a walkthrough of her house because she hasn't been back in a while and hasn't been in it in years, and so she's just kind of like figuring things out. And he sees her there on the property, and so he assumes she's like trespassing, and so they have this like little hate to love kind of vibe going on at first, where he's like, excuse me, what are you doing here? Like, I'm trying to work on this property, like who are you? You need to get out of here. And I just loved the setup of the tension between them already from that moment. The hero in here as well, he has a lot of kind of broodiness and secrets and things from his past that have tortured him. He is actually an ex-FBI profiler, and so now he's just trying to do construction with his business partner. And so we see kind of things start to happen around town. There's some old cases kind of being brought up, and so it kind of goes from there with him having to kind of step in and or wants to protect her, and he has some things from his past. And I just loved these two. They're very much like broken souls, or they've both had a lot of loss in their lives, and so I loved them like finding each other and just being that fragile sanctuary for each other. Loved it so much. Highly recommend this one. Like I said, this book is so good. Book 2 just came out, which is Delicate Escape, another amazing book with romantic suspense vibes. So if you read this one, go read that one, or read this one and then read that one as well. Next up is Steel King by Devney Perry. So this is the first book in her Clifton Forge series, and this whole series I love so much and highly recommend it. Definitely read this series in order, because at least the first 2 books in particular have kind of an overarching plot. So I highly recommend reading them in series order as well. So this is a small town series. It takes place in Montana, like all of Devney Perry's books. And this series, we actually follow a former MC or motorcycle club, where basically the club has disbanded, but we're still following all the characters in it. And we see like a little bit of their history and kind of their found family aspect as well. And here the heroine kind of moved away from her small town. She's been living, I think, in like Seattle, I want to say. I remember her being like a news reporter, and basically her family's been giving her a hard time and is like, hey, you need to move back home. And so she finally decides, you know what, I'm going to move back. So she comes back to Clifton Forge in Montana, and she decides to start working at the newspaper that her dad owns and runs, and kind of working with him there. So we see how the heroine is kind of bored with the small town monotony of kind of all the stories at the newspaper and just the life in general. And And so she's like, you know what, the Clifton Forge garage and like all of those MC members, like that has a story written all over it. Like I need to go over there and try to like, you know, find some things out. So we see her going there and she ends up meeting the hero who was the former MC club's president's son. And he's just kind of running the garage now. Like I said, the MC club kind of disbanded a year ago and it was super lucrative and successful at the time. And so she's kind of wondering what happened. Why did they separate? Why did they break up? Why are they no longer a thing? And so she wants to figure out exactly what's going on. So she kind of goes there and pretends she needs help with a car. And that's when she meets the hero. And so we see the hero's father, the former MC president, and he actually ends up getting arrested for a murder charge. And so the heroine is super adamant that his father is guilty. And so she's trying to push really hard and help the investigation to kind of prove that. And so the hero, like I said, he was really pulled to her in the beginning. And now he's like taken aback because he can't believe how hard she's going to like prove his father is guilty when he knows he's not. And so it kind of goes from there. The tension between these two is so palpable, so good. I loved in here as well how the hero and the heroine, they both push each other and he realizes that she pushes back. She's very strong-willed and I love that about her. And so he's like, you know what, I'm realizing that maybe we should work together to help out this case and solve it together and help my father, because like working against each other is not working. So they end up working together. Like I said, there's this kind of like murder case happening around them and it kind of goes from there. Highly recommend. I had such a fun time with this series, and this first book definitely pulls you into the mystery and it kind of goes into the next book in the series as well. All right, next up is Killer of Mine by Alexis Grace. So I read this one earlier this summer as well and had such a fun time with this one. This one is the first book in a new series by this author, possibly I think their debut as well. Could be wrong there, but I know it's for sure the first book in a series. So in this one, the heroine is actually the daughter of a serial killer and she's now working as a detective and she's trying to find her father before anybody else can and without them knowing that she is the daughter of this man that the FBI are searching for. So this one's actually a why choose romance, which I love. So it has multiple heroes and the one heroine. All right, so she ends up getting entangled with one of the heroes first, who's actually an agent of this serial crimes unit, and him and his FBI team or the other heroes are the ones that she ends up getting involved with. So all the heroes are working to track down the heroine's father without knowing that that's her father that they're looking for. So basically her father is known as the crosscut killer and they have this whole team and investigation that they're trying to find him. At the same time, the heroine is a detective and she's kind of on a lower rung and she's kind of working on a missing persons case, which her missing person case kind of evolves into being the latest victim of the crosscut killer. So she has to end up working with the heroes on their team of investigation without them finding out how she's related to the person that they're trying to track down. The heroes actually do end up figuring out who she is kind of quickly, and so they actually end up putting her under house arrest because they're like, I don't know if we can trust you. Also, like, you didn't tell us that you're related to the killer that we're looking for. And so it kind of goes from there. There are some twists and turns as well. I will say I personally did see where the story was going, but it was just super bingeable and I had a good time with it. So I would definitely pick up more from this author in the future and more from this series. All right, next up is Be Still My Heart, and this is a co-written book. So the authors are Emily McIntyre and Sav R. Miller. And I had such a fun time with this one. I highly recommend it on audio because it was just so good. This book definitely grabbed my attention right from the start. It's set in small town Maine. We see the hero. He's kind of this grumpy ex-Navy SEAL turned fisherman or lobster fisherman, and the heroine is a homicide detective investigating murders, and she actually goes to the hero to interview him because he's a possible suspect in a case that she's working on. I just really enjoyed the setting and the characters in this one. I loved how the hero and the heroine were really pulled to one another right from the start, and I like this mixture of like this small town setting as well as like a murder, a mystery, a romance. Definitely check this one out. All right, next up is the Mind F series by S.T. Abbey. So this is a special edition that Mystic Box did that I absolutely am obsessed with. It's just so pretty and so good. Basically, this is a 5-book or 5 novella type of bind up. So there's 5 novellas in this series and they keep following the same characters, the same story throughout. They're very bingeable and unputdownable. So I highly recommend just kind of binging them all. I think they're all like under 200 pages each, and they definitely flow into the next book and leave you kind of on a cliffhanger. So you want to keep reading to figure out what is going on with the heroine Lana and this entire story. So I feel like a lot of people have read this one, but if you haven't, I highly recommend. It's on Kindle Unlimited. This one was just super bingeable, and like I said, I had a good time with it, so much so that I had to get this special edition copy. So in this one, we're actually following the heroine, who is a serial killer, and she is doing things for reasons, which you see kind of figured out throughout the story. And here she ends up dating an FBI kind of profiler who is actually looking for her, not knowing that that's who he's looking for. And so it kind of goes from there, this very much like cat and mouse situation, which I was just obsessed with, and I just really liked how this story evolved. So yeah, I highly recommend if you haven't checked this one out yet. Like I said, this is the Mind F series, and there's 5 novellas that kind of make up the entire story. Next up is Hush Darling by Avery Kingston. So I read this one a couple years ago and had a really good time with this one, and this one I feel like is perfect for fall and winter as well. So yeah, definitely check this one out if you haven't yet. So in this one, we're following the heroine, and she's actually pregnant at the beginning of the story, and she is on the run from an abusive marriage. And so she actually ends up running into the hero, who is at a cabin during a snowstorm, and the hero is actually deaf, and so she ends up living with him or hiding out there with him. This one, I feel like the representation was done really well in the story. I also liked at the beginning of the story, the author provides her own kind of author's note of how the story is super close to her heart and kind of from her own lived experiences. And so I feel like it was done so well because of all of those influences on the story. This one, the story does move pretty fast, but it's more on the shorter side. I think it's definitely less than 300 pages. So like I said at the beginning of the story, we see the heroine on the run. She finds out that she's pregnant, she's in an abusive marriage, and she wants to get away. So she, with the help of a friend, like gets some money, she fakes her death, and she kind of takes off, and she gets stuck in that snowstorm and hides out at a cabin. And the hero kind of owns all the cabin rentals, and so he realizes somebody's staying in one of the cabins that he doesn't know about. So he goes to find her, and that's when they kind of run into one another. Like I said, the hero is deaf, and he's been living in solitude up at these cabins for quite a few years. He's struggling with a lot from his past demons, loss, kind of a bunch of trauma in his life. And so I really liked how these two found one another at the right time. These two are definitely like tortured souls who find solace together during the snowstorm. I really enjoyed it, that kind of like close forced proximity, the snowstorm setting. This one I just really enjoyed. All right, so next up are 2 co-written books. So the first one is Black Sheep. This is by Alexa Harlow and Bren Weaver. I know that Bren Weaver is super popular for her recent books like Butcher and Blackbird and Leather and Lark. These books from a few years ago from her, I actually enjoy more personally. They're less rom-com-y, kind of dark humor vibes and just more dark romance setup. So yeah, definitely enjoy these. If you haven't checked them out, I highly recommend. So this one just gets right into it from the start. It literally kicks off with a bang. The heroine is a serial killer, and we see kind of how she came to be one. She was kind of trained into it, and so we kind of see all of that set up for her character. She's a very interesting character. She's very cold and very analytical. She has like a memory palace that she can keep memories in her mind and kind of assigns them to a place. It was super interesting how it was described, and I just liked that from like the psychology of it all. So yeah, in this one, she is a serial killer, and she's trying to track down this enigmatic cult leader before the FBI can get involved. So she's kind of doing this cat and mouse game with the hero, who's actually a psychology, kind of like forensic psychologist professor at a college. He's one of her professors, I believe, for her doctorate degree. So he's her teacher, but he's also working with the FBI to track down this cult leader. And so she wants to get to the cult leader before the hero. And so she is attempting to get there first. She kind of tries to almost take out the hero at one point, and that's how she kind of becomes interested in him. And like I said, it's just super interesting. I really liked their dynamic, and the heroine in here, she was just a very interesting character. So yeah, I had a good time with this one. Highly recommend, especially if you like the Mind F series or even that Alexis Grace one I talked about earlier. You'll definitely like Black Sheep, but I feel like it's so underrated, but really, really good, especially if you want like a dark romance with that suspense element. All right, so another co-written book. So this is another of Bren Weaver's books. This is Marrow, and this one she co-wrote with Trisha Wolfe. So this one, again, this is more dark, not the kind of like dark humor that her newer books are. And I really enjoyed that about this and a Black Sheep in particular. So in this one, again, I really liked the characters in here and kind of the psychology of it all. The hero and the heroine, they're actually work colleagues who are also both serial killers, and they don't know that about one another. So this one, the hero and the heroine, they work at a college together. The hero is a forensic anthropologist and the heroine is a wildlife biologist. And so they both work at the college. Like I said, they're both serial killers, and they end up having a common enemy because an FBI agent ends up coming around the school and kind of poking around because of some unsolved cases, or like a case they're working on, and some parts that were found. And so it kind of goes from there. This one, the romance in here was a little bit slower. I think I liked Black Sheep a little bit more, but this one is really good as well. And I just really liked that kind of dynamic of the characters. This one has a ton of content warnings, so just know that going in. So yeah, actually both of these books do have heavier content warning. They get kind of dark and gory and detailed. So just know that going in. If you're like a little bit squeamish, maybe check out the content warnings ahead of time. I personally really enjoyed both of these. I do love thrillers though, and kind of that aspect of stories. So I like that kind of darker elements to my stories, especially if I'm reading like a romantic suspense. I highly recommend these if you want darker, but also like those romantic. These both have like very kinky times as well. So just know that going in. But yeah, I had a good time with both of these and highly recommend. All right, next up is Help Me Remember by Corinne Michaels, and this is the first book in her Rose Canyon series, and I love this book so much. This is actually one of my favorites from Corinne Michaels. So this book is a small town, brother's best friend. We have romantic suspense. We also have an amnesia plot. So this book kicks off with the heroine waking up in a hospital, and she realizes that she cannot remember the last 3 years of her life. She has no idea what is going on, where she's at, what happened, but she finds out that she was the only eyewitness to her brother's death. And so basically the cops tell her family and friends, like, don't tell her anything. We need to know everything that her mind can maybe remember and fill in on its own. And so it kind of goes from there with the heroine realizing that she knows something, that she doesn't know what it is, and she has to figure it out. So yeah, it kind of goes from there with the heroine. She starts to get frustrated with not remembering her life, and basically, you know, 3 years of her life are gone from her memory. And so she kind of tries to retrace her memories and her last steps and kind of all of that. And then a friend of hers ends up helping her out as well. And it kind of goes from there. I was so obsessed with this book. Like, it made me gasp out loud. I actually want to reread it now that I'm talking about it because I absolutely love this. It was one of my favorites of last year. I had such a good time with this book. Loved it so much. Highly recommend. Next up is Don't Forget Me Tomorrow by A.L. Jackson. This is part of her Time River series. You can definitely read these as standalones, but I love the first book as well. So definitely go read that one too. And this is book 2. This one is definitely lighter on the romantic suspense elements, but it's so good. I love all the tropes in here. So this is a small town setting. It has a single mom heroine. There's mutual pining. The hero is her brother's best friend, and it has a forced proximity. It is just so good. I love these two together. I love how obsessed they were with each other and that they just want to like take care of each other and protect each other and be there. There's like a lot of angst as well because neither of them thinks they can be together. Like I said, the mutual pining is done so well. Basically, the heroine ends up hearing something in the night at her house, and I loved how immediately the hero shows up and wants to move her and her son in with him so he can protect them. These two, you just totally feel their closeness and their bond. It's just so apparent like as soon as you start reading the book. Also, one of my favorite things is when the hero thinks that he's too damaged, too broken for the heroine. I love that and eat that up, and the hero in here is definitely that. He doesn't think that he's worthy enough for the heroine, and I ate this book up and loved it so much. Next up is Obsession Falls by Claire Kingsley. This is the first book in her Haven Brothers series. I read this one last fall and had such a good time with it. This one is a small town, grumpy sunshine, forced proximity, and of course romantic suspense vibes. So in this one, it starts off with the heroine moving back to her small town. At first, she ends up living with her mom, and she very quickly realizes that she needs her own place for her and her dog because it's not going to work out living with her mother. So she ends up renting a property from the Haven family, who owns like a bunch of rentals and things like that. And she ends up moving into one of them, and that's how she meets the hero because he's an owner of one of the properties. The meet cute moment in here was so good. The heroine, she basically is moving into her new place, and like I said, the hero is kind of this like a grumpy burly landlord, and he doesn't know that his sister has rented out the property already, so he just thinks somebody has broken in. So he goes into the house to figure out what's going on. The heroine is just about to step into the bathtub. So good. So these two very quickly find themselves like pulled to one another, and then around the same time the heroine starts receiving these like threatening messages around her house. This one, like I said, I love a protective hero, and the heroine here becomes very protective of the heroine. He ends up actually moving in with her because he's like, if you're getting these threats, like, I'm gonna be living here and taking care of you. So yeah, he moves in with her. I loved how he's very grumpy, but he's so like sweet and protective with her and her dog, and I just like was obsessed with this one. I need to continue on with the series because I know she has a couple out now. I think book 3 actually just came out in this series, so I need to go read the rest immediately. Next up is Beyond the Thistles by Samantha Young. This is the first book in her Highland series. I love this entire series so much, but I definitely recommend starting with the first book and kind of building from there. This book and entire series takes place in the Scottish Highlands, which the author is from Scotland as well, which I absolutely just am obsessed with the setting. The heroine in here, she is a single mom on the run. She ends up moving from the US to Scotland. So yeah, at the beginning of the story, we see the heroine and her daughter living in the US, and her father of her child is not really a great guy, and so we see some things kind of go down from there. And so the heroine ends up going on the run. She takes her daughter and she moves to Scotland. And so we catch up to her later, and she's living in the Scottish Highlands now, and she's working at this kind of like members only exclusive resort / estate, and she's working there as a housekeeper. This series does connect with her Adair family series, which I actually haven't read, and I jumped into this series first. So you can totally read these as a standalone, but they do connect to those ones because basically the estate that she's living at and working at is owned by the family of that series. And so the hero in here, he is the bodyguard, and he's very gruff and grumpy to one of the Adair family members. And so she kind of knows him because they're both at the estate working together. Like I said, I was just obsessed with the characters in here and the setting. The hero in here has some secrets and trauma from his past as well, which I just really enjoyed seeing explored. It goes into like a kind of friends with benefits situation at first. I just really enjoyed this one and highly recommend the entire series, honestly. All right, and then the last one is Does It Hurt by H.D. Carlton. I know that H.D. Carlton has a ton of more popular books, but this is the one that I enjoyed the most from her, so that's why I'm recommending it. I will say probably if I read it now, I might not as enjoy enjoy it as much as I did when I first read it. I read it when it first came out a couple years ago and had just like a good time with what it is. So maybe just know that going in. This book, I will say, is just like a wild, wild ride. I knew nothing before going in and I just had a good time with it and took it for what it was. I will say I wasn't as invested in the romance, but kind of more of the other suspenseful elements of the story. I was invested enough to figure out what was going on. This one kind of starts off, it takes place in Australia. There's this enemies to lovers situation. They end up getting isolated together at this lighthouse out in the middle of nowhere. This one very much has kind of like survival thriller vibes where they get shipwrecked and they're at this lighthouse together and kind of some like trauma bonding, and it kind of goes from there. Very wild, and yeah, just like an entertaining time though for me. So yeah, definitely just know that going in, and probably check content warnings as well. All right, so those are the 15 romantic suspense book recs that I have for you today. Definitely let me know in the comments if you have any that I need to read that you love. Definitely drop them in the comments because I want all of the romantic suspense books right now. Let me know if you enjoyed this video, if you want to see any more recommendation videos. Let me know a trope, any of those things, and I will possibly put together a video. So yeah, definitely let me know all the things in the comments and all of the romantic suspense book recs especially. If you've read any of these or are going to read any of them, I'd love to know that as well. If you'd rather leave me an emoji in the comments instead today, let me know that you watched this video, and maybe leave me a tree emoji since I have my cozy cabin retreat t-shirt on today. So yeah, leave me a tree emoji. If you haven't done so yet, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of my future videos, and I'll see you in my next one.